Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me for this last video I'm making for Heritage for All. It has been a pleasure to explore these different topics about art, culture, and museology and share it with all of you guys. So the subject of today is going to be about heritage exhibition. My video is entitled Collections on Stage, Exposing Cultural Diversity, Pre-his.panic Art in Search of Lost Time. I recommend you to read my previous article on the subject on the Heritage for All Facebook page. So, we are going to start to speak about the concept of cultural diversity by UNESCO and its connection with tangible and intangible heritage and sustainability. Then we'll continue to talk about the collection and the evolution of the museum concept. And in the end, we're going to talk about the Museum of the Jacobins à Auch in France and speak about scenography of the objects of ancient America. In 2002, the United Nations General Assembly implemented a global day dedicated to cultural diversity, for exchange and development, for intercultural dialogue and peace. This initiative was in line with the Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity adopted in 2001 by UNESCO, which places culture at the heart of this project as a tool for sustainable development, prosperity, and peace in the world. In 2015, the United Nations voted in favor of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development and the Resolution on Culture and Sustainable Development, adopted by the General Assembly on the same year in order to put in place the 17 objectives in building on the creative potential of the world's diverse culture and initiating a dialogue that promotes global sharing of sustainable development. The World Day of Cultural Diversity, which will take place on May 21, 2019, crystallizes a way to promote culture in all its forms, whether tangible or intangible. With regard to the world of museums, the 2015 UNESCO recommendation on the promotion of museums and collection, their diversity and role in society, materialized the effort of member states towards sustainable development as well, particularly through the preservation and protection of heritage and the protection and promotion of cultural diversity. In the recommendation, the term collections refers to a set of natural and cultural objects, tangible and intangible, ancient and contemporary, leaving each state to define what it means by collection in its own legal framework. The term heritage is defined as a set of tangible and intangible values and the expressions that people choose and designate independently of property considerations as reflecting the expression of their identities, beliefs, knowledge, and tradition, as well as living environments that deserve to be protected and promoted by contemporary generations and passed on to future generations. The recommendation also provides, in case where the museum represents a collection of indigenous people, appropriate measures to encourage dialogue and the development of relations between museums and these populations, particularly with regard to the management of collections, but also their return and their restitution. In the case of an exhibition of non-European arts, how does the museum represent such objects? How does one show cultural diversity in the exhibition today? Between marketing and Western vision, is not the museum stuck in a sterile aesthetic of the other museography, subscribed to the old genre and the static museography of the 30s, adopted by museums, continues to make its way as a model, both late for its time and evacuating context, as to better control the spaces and ideological and even political concepts. The question of the restitution of foreign objects to their country of origins goes hand in hand with the scenographic restitution of these objects in the very frame of the museum, thus answering to the scientific and educational function of the museum, guarantor of the correct transmission and mediation of the extra-European cultures. the construction of taste by the writing of space, according to the aesthetic criterion dear to Henri Faucillon, perpetuates a tradition at the source of modern museography, which is, however, unsuited to the current challenges of the museum. We will see the example of the Pre-his.panic collections at the Jacobin Museum in Auch, in the south of France, the second museum after the Quai Branly Jacques Chirac in terms of Pre-his.panic art. Does the museum correctly reproduce the millennia cultures of ancient America, or its content with an aesthetic presentation? What cultural diversity means? According to the UNESCO text, cultural diversity can be defined as the principle of organizing a sustainable plurality in and through societies. It is a mechanism for organizing a dialogue as productive as possible between relevant past and desirable future. This diversity must benefit from the dialogue between societies, similar to that of globalization, based on the market economy benefiting from trade across borders. Cultural diversity would be a mechanism that ensures that creativity, dignity, and tolerance are partners in establishing models of sustainable development. Cultural diversity is considered a value that recognizes differences in human societies as components of systems and relationships. It forms an inexhaustible resource for strengthening links between cultural values and material well-being. This diversity also has a link of sustainability with biodiversity because the land does not have an infinite capacity for regeneration, and global stocks depend on the preservation of biodiversity and the care provided to it at all levels of government. It's been established that there's an indivisibility of culture and development, supporting the capacities of aspiration, memory, and empowerment. Cultural diversity is an engine of development, of sustainability linked to the diversity of visions and cultural aspirations. What are the links with tangible and intangible heritage and sustainability? UNESCO, in its Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, states that the tangible heritage is a component of the physical heritage of particular societies and all of humanity, which is characterized by places of high moral and religious resonance, artistic or historical, such as, but not limited to, the landscape, a mountain, a river, highly elaborate objects, structures, or physical systems. Such legacies may belong to small groups, entire nations, or humanity as a whole, although the limits of these forms of possession may be intensely debated in a world without watertight boundaries. Tangible heritage is a kind of crystallized culture value, and cultural diversity is helping to build on this legacy. Intangible heritage, on the other hand, is defined by UNESCO as a map or compass from which human beings interpret, select, reproduce, or disseminate their cultural heritage as a whole. It is a tool for defining and expressing material heritage, and from which the inert landscape of objects and monuments is transformed into a living archive of cultural values. Without tangible heritage, the intangible heritage would be too abstract, an illegible series of objects or sites. Intangible heritage must be conceived as a larger framework within which material heritage finds its form and meaning. This tool enables communities and societies to establish the archives of the relationship between cultural values and valuable cultural goods. The UNESCO text draws attention to the fact that cultural industries can sometimes be dangerous, delivering local populations to global consumption, diverting cultural values into tourist shows, transforming cultural products into commodities regardless of the dignity of their producers. This notion of tangible and intangible heritage goes hand in hand with sustainability, which can be defined as a criterion of chances of long-term survival of any desirable human adventure. It is the ability to replicate and revitalize essential human resources in the context of new forms of global market integration and new opportunities for intercultural dialogue. UNESCO insists that sustainability viewed from the perspective of cultural plurality cannot be dissociated from sustainability in economic development. Now, let's talk about collections, because collections are an instinct. The taste for the collection of objects appears very early in human history, stresses Edmond Couchot. The search for colored sensations, pleasure to the sight, to the touch, or to the ear, the forms of nature, are concretized in the symbolic behavior of man. In Homo sapiens, certain objects seem to limit themselves to stimulating visual and tactile perception without any precise meaning. The first of these objects are spotted from the discovery of figurative, nonverbal thinking. They are of unusual character, said the professor, in relation to other objects like artifact, a line series of marks engraved on long bones as a lunar calendar, or red ochre found in burial attached to the notion of sacred. Curiosities, as anthropologists call them, are crystal or fossils, for example, which were voluntarily deposited after being picked up and then arranged and put away. They are the oldest manifestation of symbolic thought that has left a material trace. André Leroi-Gourhan sees in this gesture a quest for the natural fantasy and a quest for beauty as a mechanism of the mind, the aesthetic feeling. In the Mysterium Man, a culture that stretched from 200,000 to 30,000 BC in Eurasia and the Near East, there are collection practices that includes the gathering of ochre, unusual fossils, and rare minerals, etc. These curiosities would have been related to magic or medicinal practices, to shamanism, for example. These men would make a complete aesthetic experience, receptive and operative through the collection of objects, that is a form of construction, a work intended to charm, impress, or delight the viewer. The birth of the museum, or the invention of it as described by Roland Scher, has, as we know it, been revealed to the public through the centuries through different ways in Europe. Whether it was the cult of the Muses or the myth of the Library of Alexandria that inspired the conceptualization of the museum is not known for certain. However, this, in turn, led to the creation of a celebration known as the Feast of the Musea on the borders of Thessaly and Macedonia, which was practiced every 5 years in Delphi and Athens. It is the notions of the assembly of sages that the Lycée of Aristotle, the Academy of Plato, and others alike helped inspire the creation of the museum. The search for the truth. It was the circle of the assembly of the sages which inspired the architectural plan for the Greek theater, the place of theophany and expression of the Dionysus passions. Thus the museum stands between the forces of Dionysus and Apollo, sometimes classic, sometimes Baroque, but in connection with the arts, including that of the theater. This theatricality imposes itself by the sets it allows to build the context of the exhibition and to integrate the visitor in the tour. Baroque inspiration of the royal courts, the cabinet of curiosities, eclectic mix of objects of all kinds, is a representation of the microcosm, in power embodied by the space of the prince, then the princely galleries, the collections of Roman antiquities by courtiers, jurists, scientists, or artists. The radical change appears with the advent of enlightenment and the entrance of the museum into the era of the rational. The encyclopedic museum represents the project of the new man, and his taste for positivism. In the 19th century, the Romantic aesthetic reached the theater and its style of décor, grandiloquent rhetoric, feeling, and reconstruction through scenography. The museum is subject to a major reform in the first third of the 20th century. For the first time, experts gather to talk about museography, and it is the sacred, neutral, functional museum that is emerging. If the 19th century is the golden age of museum in Europe, it is a true phenomenon of society. Architecture reminiscent of Greek temples, rotundas, natural light, and concern for airy presentation. The 20th century is characterized by a museology of the rupture, as Jacquinard said, that will bring the museum into the postmodern era. Produced by a political will to democratize culture, competition from new media, and the arrival of new technologies, the postmodern museum challenges history to bring stories. The last 30 years is characterized by an aesthetic of theatricality in the largest museum of the world in order to attract ever larger audiences. The exhibition, a real communication medium, is part of the process leading to the advent of artificial intelligences or augmented reality. But the history of museums is also linked to colonial issues, the construction of nations and identities, the construction of the gaze of others, and the transformation of art and culture as a real act of power. In our time, the museum has become part of the social space, allowing it to spread its discourses, culture, and arts through an ideology elaborated within its scientific program, notably exhibitions and mediation, whether they are permanent, temporary, or itinerant. The process of the musealization of objects, that is to say, the extraction of physical or conceptual object from its original context, giving it a new status, operates in an obvious way, allowing it to be attributed to an autonomous value in relation to its place of production and makes these objects emancipated objects of their cultural milieu. The places of presentation in exhibitions tend to reflect this observation in museography, which focuses on erasing all traces of context in favor of so-called neutral spaces. In this sense, the object presented without links to its contextual set is isolated, apart from, manipulated in an elaborated narrative, a narrative frame with a thematic written as the chapter of a book, with its drama, a progression, and a conclusion, obeying an ideological discourse. These are interpretations to give a perception of the reality of a given culture to a given audience. Space itself is at the center of the semiotics of exhibitions, that is to say, space as such communicates a message about what is given to see. It is about writing a history of culture through space and scenography, using objects whose identity is discarded in favor of the staged narrative. The contemporary exhibition is the subject of numerous studies on the various processes that generate it and which are at the source of its implementation in museums and well beyond its walls. Selected themes ranging from sorting to the selection of art objects, from ordering to language, from discourse or synopsis to scenography, from neutrality to the theatricality of spaces of all kinds, from ideological politics to the use of cognitive science in the tours. The exhibition is a context of visual universes which encompasses all the senses, recreating the culture of a given era for the spectator of the present time. In the case of pre-Hispanic civilizations, pre-Hispanic art gives rise to exponentially decontextualized expo production in which remarkable pieces are musealized at the mercy of a marketing force integrated into a system of ideas manufactured by the museum entity. Associated with prestige and exotism, the pre-Hispanic collections allowed to deploy a multisensory scenario able to produce, in the perception of the visitor, an imaginal, as Henri Corbin would say, world, a kind of between two worlds culture induced by the scenography. Immersion, interaction, communication, neutrality, sensory world. What are the current dynamics of the exhibition today? What are the museum's methods for transmitting cultural diversity? The exhibition is a machine to manufacture a unique cultural perception at the expense of diversity, as is often the case for the extra-European arts. Often pre-Hispanic cultures are shown in unique sets as if they belonged to a single large group. The museum space and that of the collection deal with the identity of the museum and its mission to transmit correctly. The museographic representative style of the pre-Hispanic is widely visible in the Pavillon des Sessions at the Louvre, antenna of Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac, whose scenography was created by Jean-Michel Villemotte in favor of a modernist and minimalist aesthetic genre. This example completed the museological action currently underway in museums, that of a systematic decontextualization of non-European objects. In the Louvre, the very selection of objects for the collection made by Jacques Kershage has aroused criticism, the exhibits having been chosen only for their aesthetic value. Even though the Muséum du Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac, through its director Stéphane Martin, states to show the object from the point of view of the indigenous population and to contextualize, this still remains to be demonstrated, as all we see are these dark spaces and windows as a scenography in the museum. Contextualization should not be limited to cartels and panels on the walls, some effects of music or marking on the ground. Where is the sacred dimension of the pre-Hispanic art without a proper scenography? Let's see the example of the Jacobin Museum in France and how pre-Hispanic art is exhibited as a cultural diversity in Auch. The Jacobin Museum in Auch has the second largest pre-Hispanic art collection in France, second to the Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac Museum. Closed for work in April 2019, the museum will reopen its doors next spring, unveiling its new museography. More than 500 objects were presented in the 5 rooms that were previously open to the public. The history of the collection dates back to Guillaume Pujos, art lover and adventurer who settled in Chile in 1879. And soon he assembled a rich collection of pieces, including Andean and Chilean ceramic ethnographic objects from North America and sculptures of the sacred art of Latin America. In 1906, Pujos returned to France and became curator of the museum in 1911, where he exhibited the most beautiful works of his personal collection. When he died in 1921, all his gathered objects were bequeathed to the city of Auch to enrich American collections. Then, in the year 1948, the curator Henri Polge began a new project for the museum by assembling collections from the American collections of the Museum of Ézy de Taillac and the Museum of Annecy. 1,200 objects in total are now the only collection in the region. The curator's ambition was to respond to a scientific and cultural project that located the Auch Museum just behind the Musée de l'Homme in Paris in terms of pre-Hispanic art collections. The acquisition of Saint-Grégory, Mass guided the Americanist inclination of the museum to complete this unprecedented dynamic. The long history of the enrichment of the collection was concretized during the last 10 years by rich donations. Today, the Museum of the Jacobins has more than 10,000 objects ranging from Peru, Central America and Mesoamerica, counting among them sets of goldsmiths and Andean textiles. Between 2005 and 2015, the museum has integrated itself into the history of the city. Many extra-European collections were formed and brought to France during the 19th century. Exhibited in an outdated encyclopedic museography, the pieces were often kept in the reserves and the context was lost for many of them. Pascal Monge listed more than half of the 22,000 archaeology items in the pre-Hispanic world. But how to study them, how to exhibit them? Often the presentations are reduced to showcases with objects representative of the exposed culture. Apart from the Quai Branly-Jacques Chirac Museum, the most important collections are in the National Archaeology Museum in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, close to Paris, and La Cité de la Céramique in Sèvres. In France, the main establishments with more than 400 objects are le Musée de Boulogne-sur-Mer, le Musée de Louis-Philippe at Château d'Eu, the Museum of Rouen, the Museum of the Nouveau Monde à La Rochelle, the Museum d'Aquitaine in Bordeaux, the Périgord Museum in Périgueux, the Toulouse Museum, the Castres Museum in Cannes, the Barcelonnette Museum, the Museum of African, Oceanic and Amerindian Art in Marseille, and the Museum of Confluence in Lyon. The other museums gathers only 50 pre-Hispanic pieces. The decor of the scenography chosen for the presentation of pre-Hispanic collections alternates different colored walls corresponding to spaces dedicated to the great cultures of ancient America, bright green for the Andean region with narrative sequences, purple for the treasures of Peru, including various showcases with ornament, ceramic, and textiles, blue night for Mexico, orange for Latin America's sacred art, and the School of Quito, and finally turquoise blue for Central America and Mesoamerica. The furniture is simple. It consists of showcases illuminated with nuances, showing a progressive staging with pedestals, sometimes some pyramid-like structure reminiscent of pre-Hispanic architecture and classic cartels. On the walls are panels of mediation that locate historical, geographical, and cultural context with a classification by culture. Each showcase indicates the culture concerned. In the Andean era, we find different cultures. In the first part, we begin with the presentation of Peru, proceeding with the founding cultures Paracas, Mochiques Recuay, Vicus Viru, Cupisnique Chavin, Lambayeque, Chimuchancay, Inca, and Tiahuanaco. A portrait of Guillaume Pujos is placed high between the prestigious Inca and Tiahuanaco cultures. Museography stages the collector and places it above the objects themselves. Then the theme of architecture is evoked in a panel associated with a very brief explanation of the four cultures of Chavin, Mochica, Chimu, and Inca. The treasure room of Peru shows jewels, ceramic, and Andean textiles in a luxurious atmosphere. There is a distinction between the two rooms, and the notion of treasure is enhanced by dark red and soft lighting. The distinction of different culture is barely underlined, and the showcases are responding to each other in scenographic nuances. The confusion is certain for the public, especially for the chronology, which is not sufficiently marked. The Mexico room covers the period from 1510 to 1539 AD and contains the Saint Gregory Mass, which is the hallmark of the museum. The midnight blue refers to a religious atmosphere. It portrays the evangelization of Mexico, the struggle of the Franciscan brothers in defense of the Indian, and an extract from the Bubble Sublimis Deus, subtly illuminated by a golden lighting. The rooms of Central America are in deep color of the Mayan blue, although the spaces are classified by different cultures and various regions of Mesoamerica as well. The culture Gran Socle of the Pacific coast of Panama, the cultures Gran Nicoya and Gran Chiriquí from the Pacific coast of Costa Rica, the culture of Teotihuacan in central Mexico, the Zapotec culture from the Oaxaca region, the Huastec culture of the northern coast of Gulf of Mexico, and for Mesoamerica, the Mayan culture of the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, and Belize, the Chupicuaro culture found in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, the Western cultures of the state of Nayarit, the Totonac culture of the central coast of the Gulf, and the Aztec culture from central Mexico. We also find in the same rooms a South American culture on this list, namely the Marajo, culture which originates on an island at the mouth of the Amazon River in Brazil. All these different cultures are exhibited without any scenic distinction, reminiscent of unified ensemble of the same period. However, the chronologies are vast and should be dissociated by a clear presentation. Although the scenography of the tour of pre-Hispanic collections in the museum tries to contextualize these objects by cartels and panels of mediation, note that museography here involves only simple traditional elements such as showcases, pedestals, cartels, headlines, sometimes isolated objects, accumulated objects sorted by genre, by culture, by region, and adapted light which stages the exhibition by consistently sublimating only a handful of the objects. The different colors of the walls symbolically represent a change of scenery or evoke a luxurious or solemn world. The chronologies are not highlighted, and the viewer does not know from the outset, by the headlines inscribed on the showcases, at what time these cultures flourished, and very few chronological references are given to him or her, which makes comparing the items difficult. The cultural mediation of the Museum of the Americas section does not contextualize the universe of the emergence of these cultures enough, in particular in the field of architecture, where its sacred dimension could be transcribed more explicitly by an evocation with images of temples, pyramids, or palaces, for example. The museography seems to be better contextualized in the section Popular Arts and Traditions, with the use of immersive and partially staged sets. The new Jacobin Museum will reopen in 2019, and let's hope it will recontextualize the presentation of its exhibition with the objective of transmitting its messages in a more scientific and rigorous way, sharing the knowledge of complex cultures, otherwise difficult to apprehend for the public of non-initiés. The promotion of cultural diversity also involves scientific research programs, studying the collection and archives, working on the inventory and history of this collection in order to transcribe in 3D and through scenography and context put this distant civilization in their original setting. The perspective of non-European culture in the context of the museum and its exhibitions will have to consider the essence of its cultures. Otherwise, they will remain an aesthetic museography without scientific value and an expression of cultural counterfeiting. It is through the in situ restitution and contextualization that the valorization of the cultural diversity can become a reality. Le Domaine de Chantilly presents the private apartment of the Duke and Duchess of Aumale after restoration, inviting the visitor to an immersion in the atmosphere of its time. It only remains to apply this method for the non-European arts. Thanks for listening et à bientôt!